I lived and worked in the town of Crieff for many years, and at one time actually I lived in a tenement building in Corton Place, which was right across from where the body of Peter Sharp was found. I was told quite early on that a murder had been committed there, but I had heard lots of different stories regarding this murder. Some people told me he'd been shot. Nobody seemed to know the full story. So here it is, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Crieff sits in West Perthshire. It's a market town and very, very important historically. And here is a story of a killing that took place in the 1800s. Stonemason Peter Sharp was glad to be returning home to Crieff for the weekend of the Saturday the 7th of March 1874. He worked during the week in the village of Fellswester, which is to the north east of Crieff, and he returned at the weekend to stay with his parents, who lived in Burrell Street in Crieff. On that Saturday night, Peter, after eating with his mother and father, picked up his silver watch with its gold Albert chain, put on his hat, and left the house. He had about 16 shillings in his pocket. John Sharp, Peter's father, would later see his son a couple of times that night as they passed each other on the opposite side of the street. No doubt a cheery wave would have passed between father and son. From Burrell Street, Peter made his way to the home of photographer John Kidd. He owed Kidd some money for some carte de visits, a small card with a name and picture left as a calling card, often given between young single men and women. Sharp and Kidd then walked to see Jessie Donaldson, who lived with her sister in King Street. Peter had a drink with the two women and arranged to go for a walk with Jessie the next day, Sunday the 8th. Sharp and Kidd parted company after visiting Jessie, and Peter then met scavenger John Tracy from Bridgend. At just before 11, the two men walked into Miss Helen Sinclair's public house at the Cross. Peter ordered 2 whiskies and paid for them both. After finishing his drink, Peter asked for a bottle to be filled with half a munchkin, about half a pint of whisky, to take away. Peter Sharp and John Tracy then left the pub and walked down to John's home in Bridgend. When they arrived, John asked Peter if he was going home. He replied he was going back into the town. John Graham Gow, a grocer in King Street, stood at his door at about 11:15 and watched Peter Sharp walk up the street alone. Gow thought Sharp may be turning and walking along Commissioner Street, before taking a left and heading up Duckledge Road towards the High Street. Duncan Reid, a flesher who lived in Commissioner Street, walked down Ramsay Street with his sweetheart, Mary McCrory. They had just left Mary's mother's house. While walking down Mans Road, now Potenzie Road, they heard a male voice cry out, "Murder!" The couple turned round and headed back up the street. When they got to Bank Street, a man ran past them. Peter McGregor, a joiner who lived in Duckridge Road, left his friends in Sim's public house to go home. McGregor met one of his pals at the county buildings, the Tollbooth Clock Tower, and after standing chatting to this man, McGregor, at about 11:30, walked down Cornton Place. When passing the door of a Mr. Thomas Roy, McGregor noticed a man lying on the road. Peter McGregor, thinking the man was lying drunk, pulled him from the road and propped him up against Roy's front door. McGregor recognised the man as Peter Sharp. The joiner said to the man, "I ken you, Peter. Do you not recognise me?" Getting no reply, McGregor made Sharp as comfortable as possible. Thinking Sharp drunk, and as the weather that night was fine and not cold, McGregor then left to continue home.
Or Castle Menzies after dark.
Is it really haunted?
Is it really haunted?
Book now to find out.
If you dare.
When Peter McGregor arrived at his house, he was already having doubts about the way he left Sharp, telling his wife that he ought to go back to Corton Place and assist Sharp. His wife, Mrs. McGregor, told him that he ought not to go out, and by the time he got back to Corton Place, Sharp would have been found and helped by someone else. Indeed, someone else had found the man slumped against Mr. Roy's front door. 2 patrolling policemen, Inspector William Stevenson and Constable McCarty, while passing through Cotton Place just after midnight, found the man. The policemen also thought Sharp drunk. The constable picked up Sharp's hat and placed it on his head. They tried to correspond with the man. The gas street lights had been put out, and the 2 policemen had no lamps, and in the darkness thought that the man, who they recognised, was in a drunken sleep, so they left him. Inspector Stevenson would receive criticism in court for leaving the man in that state. Thomas Roy, a weaver, had gone home on the Saturday night, the 7th of March, at about 10 p.m. When Roy tried the door, he found it locked, what he thought unusual for that time of night. When let in, Roy found out the reason for the locking of the door. There were tinkers about in Crieff. The tinkers, the McCallum family, consisted of old John McCallum and his wife Mary, their son George and his wife Annie, and several children, 2 girls, Agnes and Isabella, who were either John or George's. A 3rd child, Anne Stewart, was a daughter of George's wife Annie and his stepdaughter. The family travelled the country, making and selling baskets and spoons made from horn. While lying in bed, Thomas heard a noise that he said sounded like a dud or dunt against his front door. Then a voice saying something like, "I know you, Peter," or "Do you know me, Peter?" Minutes later, Thomas heard a couple of male voices speaking in a low tone. Thomas's daughter Janet also heard the sound of someone shouting, "Bell, bell," in a low whispered voice. The sound of someone moaning, and a faint voice asking, "Are you in? Are you sleeping?" Janet heard this at about 12:20 a.m. Then more voices, 2 men talking in hushed tones, and when she looked out the window, she saw 2 policemen standing talking in the street. Labourer Donald McGregor passed through Cotton Place on his way to work at Patensie Street, just after 7 a.m. on the morning of Sunday the 8th of March. As he passed the doorway of Thomas Roy's house, he noticed a man lying slumped against the door. Donald, also thinking the man sleeping off the effects of drink, walked over to check on him. As he approached, he noticed a pool of blood underneath the figure and on its clothing and boots. McGregor knocked on Roy's window, and when Roy emerged, he recognised the body as that of Peter Sharp. Blood, drops and bloody footprints led from Duckledge Road to Thomas Roy's door. Thomas Roy and his daughter went to fetch the police, as McGregor stayed with the body. A boy was sent to inform Sharp's mother and father about their son's death. When the authorities turned up, the body was placed in a wheelbarrow and taken away. It became clear that Peter had been stabbed in the groin, as a bloody hole could be seen in his trousers. His watch and chain were missing, and someone had rifled his pockets. A boy later found the dead man's wallet behind a wall in a garden in Cotton Place. Dr. Andrew Buist arrived from Perth to carry out a post-mortem, along with a Dr. William Roy, also from Perth. A stab with a sharp implement to the abdomen, 3/4 of an inch long and 3/8 wide, had severed an artery that had caused death. The doctors also noted that the contents of the deceased's stomach smelled of whisky. Death would have taken between 5 to 15 minutes. The doctors thought the wound would not cause a spout or spray of blood, but would trickle from the puncture. John Kidd and a man called John Hardy were the first 2 men the police suspected of being involved in the killing. Many witnesses told of seeing Kidd with Peter Sharp that night. Kidd also had blood stains on his clothing, and Hardy had been heard to shout up at Kidd's window, "If he did not come down, the man would be dead." Both these men would be released without charge. The blood on Kidd's clothing was as a result of a fight he had with his wife that night, and Hardy's shout related to a man who'd taken ill in the street. The police also arrested George McCullum at Craigentor, just north of the village of Gilmerton. The police picked up George's mother, Mary, on the Crieff to Comrie Road on the 11th, 3 days after the murder. The McCullums had been in Crieff on the Saturday the 7th of March, getting drunk and creating a nuisance, In fact, earlier that day, Inspector Stevenson had escorted a few of them out of town. Both George and Mary were charged and tried with murder at the High Court in Perth on the 11th of September 1874. The two prisoners appeared in prison uniform, but the judge ordered them to be dressed in the clothes they were arrested in. A number of witnesses gave accounts of the whereabouts and actions of the McCallum family on the night of the murder. Jane MacDonald, the landlady of the Star Hotel, told the court that George McCallum and a young boy walked into her premises and brought 2 shillings worth of whisky. Mrs. MacDonald poured the spirit into a bottle and McCallum took it away with him. George returned to the Star that evening with an older man, and they had a gill of whisky. George complained of having a sore hand and said he would seek medical advice. Dr. Archibald Thom from Crieff told that George McCallum had visited him on the evening of the 7th of March. McCallum showed the doctor his hand, which Thorn remembered as being swollen and red. George said he had pricked his hand with a thorn. When asked if the injury would prevent him opening a knife, the doctor replied it depended on the stiffness of the knife. The doctor also stated that he had not seen the accused wearing a watch and chain that evening. James Morris, a plumber, told the court that on the night of the killing, he and some friends were in Commissioner Road at about 10:55 p.m. when they saw a group of tinkers. He said the group consisted of a man, 2 females and a boy. The man lay on the ground. This woman looked like the prisoner in the dock. Morris stated that this woman came up to him and his group and asked for some tobacco, and that he gave her some. Then she asked for money. He refused to hand over any cash. As they walked away, Morris stated that the woman went back to her friends, singing and dancing. He stated that she did not seem to be drunk, but was a little intoxicated. James Morris said that as they walked away, the tinkers shouted after them, and his friends seemed to think they might have got into trouble with these tinkers if they had not walked away. The tinkers and another small group were also seen by Thomas Thompson as he put out the street lamps between 11:30 p.m. and 12 o'clock a.m. John Stobie, a porter, lived in Duckledge Road, stated that on the night of the 7th of March 1874, Mary McCallum came into his house at about 10 p.m. to light her pipe. He later heard heavy footsteps in the road around midnight. These were followed by lighter steps. Stobie's house is the nearest to that of Thomas Roy, where the body was found. Janet McGregor lived in Bank Street and told of hearing a very heavy step pass along Bank Street towards the east and a shout of "Geordie." Peter Stewart, a joiner who lived in East High Street on the morning of the 8th of March at about 6:40 a.m. looked out of his window and saw a man he could not identify, but said wore the same clothing as the prisoner. This man came out of Stewart's shed. Stewart went down to the shed and found it had been broken into. He found a smashed gin bottle. He also noticed the indentation of a man on the ground amongst hen droppings. Peter told the court that later that day he saw the policemen coming into Crieff with 2 tinkers, an old man and a younger man, and it struck him that the young man was very much like the man he had seen running from the shed. Peter stated that it would take 5 to 6 minutes to come from Duckledge Road to his shed. William Mackenzie, a wool spinner and a beadle of the Independent Church, living in Commissioner Street, talked of going to light the fire in the church at 6:30 a.m. on the Sunday. Mackenzie told the court he saw 2 men, 2 women and a boy and child. William recognised the younger man he saw as a prisoner in the dock. The witness stated that the younger man was standing where the rest sat, and the young man seemed very excited. William watched a boy remove something from the man's pocket, then place it back in to the same pocket. William Weatherspoon, a little boy who delivered milk, said that as he was returning to his father's farm, he saw a group of tinkers. The boy noticed one of the travellers had a yellow watch chain dangling from his pocket. Asked if this man with the watch was the accused in the dock, William thought it was George McCallum, but couldn't be sure, as he was 60 or 70 yards from the Tinkers at the time. The next witness, Grace McLean, a shopkeeper in Gilmerton, said that the McCallums came into a shop on the morning of the 8th. They wanted tea and sugar. The man Grace spoke to had a bandaged hand. She asked him why he had not bought tea and sugar the day before in Crieff, and he replied that he had no money then. Mrs. McLean also stated that during the conversation she had the sound of money in George McCallum's pocket. While in Gilmerton, a village a couple of miles east of Crieff, Mary McCallum told Anne Crerar that a man had been murdered in Crieff, on the back road between two high dykes, and that his silver money and his watch were taken off him. Mary stated that she would never forget the cries of the murdered man, admitting to being at or near the scene of the crime at the time of the stabbing of Peter Sharp. Mary, who seemed to be struggling to hold it together, then said to a James Robertson in Gilmerton, "I can't get the cries of the murdered man out of my ears." Mary admitted to James, "We had a scuffle, and we followed him on his blood." She stated that she heard Peter's last words, which were, "God have mercy upon my soul." James admitted when questioned that Mary McCallum did not say who murdered Peter Sharp or what the objects stolen from him were. John Thompson, a Crieff mason, told of finding a button about 10 yards from Thomas Roy's door. This button matched one missing from the clothing of George McCallum. Constable John McCarty told of arresting George McCallum. He said the whole family were in Craigentor, apart from Mary. McCarty found 3 knives in a bundle the McCallums carried. The second day of the trial took place on Saturday the 12th of September. Andrew McCallum, a boy of between 10 and 12 years, took the stand. When asked his age, Andrew replied, "I dinna ken." Andrew told the court that the accused, George McCallum, was his brother and Mary his mother. Andrew said, "I remember on a Sunday hearing of a man being killed in Crieff. On the Saturday afternoon before that the whole lot of us were in Crieff. There was a good deal of whisky amongst us. I and my sisters and the bairns slept at the back of a house amongst the sticks near Gilmerton Road. George was not there, nor my mother. We left my mother and my brother George before the lamps were put out." Andrew also admitted to seeing his brother George with a knife often. He denied taking a knife out of George's pocket, then placing it back, as seen by William Mackenzie. The next witness, gamekeeper Duncan McCara from Gilmerton, told of meeting George McCallum on the Saturday. McCara said George McCallum tried to sell him a brown-handled, sharp-pointed pocket knife. The gamekeeper refused to buy the knife and stated he did not see the knife open. Things took an unexpected turn when the next witness appeared. Standing in a dock, a young girl between 5 or 6 years old. This was Mary Stewart, the stepdaughter of George McCallum. There seemed to be a discrepancy or confusion as to the wee girl's name. The court called her out as Mary McCallum. The defence stated that her real name was Anne Reid, but we will just call her Mary. She had been taken to Abernethy after the rest of her folk. She stayed with the Abernethy policeman, Alexander McLean. Mary, who spoke calmly and without hesitation, is worth quoting at length. She said, "I do not know how old I am. George McCallum is my stepfather, and there is an old woman I call Granny. That's George's mother. And there are girls, George's sisters. I recollect when the police came and took away George's mother, my Granny. We were all going about Crieff on a Saturday afternoon. My father and Granny had whisky. We were on the road that leads to Heron's farm, to the town, the Duckledge or back road. We were all there. It was there some of us went one way and some another. A strange man that had drink in a bottle came up to us. My father pulled it, and the man gave him a good drop of the drink, and gave my Granny a good drop. My father went away to Heron's shed. My Granny went away somewhere into a house, and the rest of us went into a garden among sticks and slept. After the man gave my father and granny the drink, my father stabbed him and went away with the knife. My granny, after the man was stabbed, took the bottle from him and gave it to my father. I saw her take nothing else out of the pocket of the man who was stabbed. When the strange man was with us, he had a watch and chain. My father took it out of the man's pocket and went away with it to a garden with stones, and made a mark where the watch was put. When asked how she had witnessed this after saying she had gone into the garden and fallen asleep, Mary said that shortly after she fell asleep, her mother joined them and woke her. Mary then spoke of being told by her father to come and see the blood. George took Mary and others to see the scene of the crime. George said, "I'll be put in jail and I shall be killed." Incredibly, Mary recounted being shown the body of Peter Sharp. She said she saw a man with his head hanging down and he never moved. Inspector Stevenson told the court about a month after the killing he took Mary to Crieff and asked her to show him where the stabbing took place. The policeman stated that Mary walked ahead, stopping of her own accord and apparently without any hesitation, and told him that this was the place, and it was the exact spot where the traces of blood had commenced. The policeman stated he had made a little mark on the wall, a private mark, which no one else knew or could see. This was to remind him of the exact spot, as of course all traces of the crime were long gone. Mary stopped at this very point, next to the secret mark. Anne Crerar, also with Inspector Stevenson, when Mary pointed to the murder site, corroborated the inspector's story. Bella McCullum, the sister of George and auntie of Mary, disputed the fact that Mary could have seen the stabbing. Bella, called Belle by her family, denied being in the area of the attack on Peter Sharp. Bella said, as Mary's mother had drunk so much that night she could not look after Mary, so she took charge of the young girl. She said that they met George, her mother and brother near the cross, and then they slept near the toll house. Bella was, when asked, denied being in Corton Place that night. Bella's sister, Agnes, also backed up the story that Mary could not have seen the stabbing, as she was nowhere near the scene. Agnes stated that she did not see George with a knife that night. The declarations of the prisoners were read. George McCullum made a startling revelation. George denied being involved in the killing of Peter Sharp. He blamed the man's death on his mother. He stated, "Me and my mother were down the road leading to the railway and met a man upon the road the worse of drink, and she, my mother, took half a munchkin of whisky, which was in a bottle from the man. After she took the bottle, the man wanted it back. Before she took the bottle, he asked my mother if she would take a dram. After she took the bottle, he bully-ragged to get the bottle back, and then she took a watch from the man, but it being dark, I did not see whether there was a chain at it. She then took the knife out of my pocket and stabbed the man. I ran away, and was all night in a shed at the side of the road to Madderty." George stated that the man took hold of his mother in an attempt to get his bottle back. He said that he got between the man and his mother and tried to split them up, but the man pushed him away. In another statement, George said that his mother had disposed of the murder weapon and stolen watch. She threw them over the Crieff Bridge into the River Erne. He also said that after she had got rid of the evidence, Mary McCullum warned him that if he ever told where she had thrown them, she would stab him as sure as she had stabbed the man. George then said his mother picked up a rock and struck him over the head with it, and called him a bitch's son. Mary then took 3 pence from her waistcoat pocket and told George to go to the public house at the end of the bridge for drink. The tavern being shut, George kept the money and spent it on drink with his father in Gilmerton the next morning. Then Mary McCullum's statements were read out. She said she was 70 years old, and on the night of the 7th of March she was real drunk. Mary stated that she slept in a close near the East Toll House. In the morning she searched for the rest of her family. Not able to find her folk, she left Crieff at between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. and walked towards Gilmerton. On the road she met the police escorting husband and son into custody. Mary first heard about the killing when told by some people at the East Toll Bar. Admitting to being too drunk to remember much about the previous night, she denied being involved in the stabbing and robbing of Peter Sharp. At the summing up of the evidence, the Crown stated that young Mary, the wee girl aged 5 or 6, played a key role. Mary had described the killing, and it would be up to the jury to decide on her intelligence and truthfulness. The evidence of Janet Roy, who'd stated she heard the soft shout of "Bell, bell." This indicated, as Mary had stated, that the Tinkers did in fact make their way to the door of Thomas Roy, where Mary stated she saw the man slumped over. Both prisoners had seen and admitted to being in the vicinity of Duckledge Road, the scene of the stabbing. The jury, if agreeing that the McCallums were involved in the fatal assault, had to decide just who had inflicted the fatal injury. George McCallum, seen with a watch and chain after the killing of Peter Sharp, did not appear to have these articles before the killing. This was described as damning evidence. The defence argued that the stabbing of Peter Sharp was sudden and unpremeditated. This should lead to a verdict of culpable homicide. The button found near the scene of the crime, although matching one missing from George McCallum's coat, the defence said that the man who found it stated that he found it sunk in the earth, and it may have been there for a long time. The defence also argued that Mary's evidence could have been as a result of being told what to say in the time between George McCallum's arrest and that of his mother, Mary's. The jury retired to consider the case. When they returned, they stated that they found Mary unanimously not guilty. Asked about George, the foreman of the jury stated guilty, but asked by a majority of 14-1 for mercy on the ground that the crime was not premeditated. The judge, Lord Ardmillan, ordered George McCallum to be taken back to the prison and fed on bread and water until his execution at between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on the 3rd of October, 1874. While in the condemned cell in prison, George received a number of visits from family members. Anne, George's wife, came to visit. She brought with her a newborn baby and a wee girl aged about 2 to 3 years old. The children seemed to be George's. The Dundee Courier, dated on the 15th of October, reported George's visits in detail, and it would seem that they had an informant who must have been at one of these meetings, a prison guard perhaps, or it might have been the case that the visitors themselves had given the reporters an account of their visit. The paper stated that, when being told of Annie's impending visit, George simply said, "Oh, aye." When his wife arrived, George remained sitting. The couple did not hug, kiss or embrace in any way. Annie simply said to him, "This is a terrible thing you have come to, Geordie." Annie received a reply of "Oh, aye." She showed George his newborn child, but according to the paper, he hardly looked at the baby. George did hold out a hand to the wee girl, and he drew her near so he could kiss her. When the visit was over, Annie said to her husband, as she looked at him for the last time, "Fare ye well, Geordie." He asked her to look after the children, and she answered that she would. George also received a visit from his mother, Mary, who he had tried to blame for the murder. Despite this, Mary met her son with the words, "The Lord bless us, Geordie. Give me your hand and your kiss, my son." The two talked, and Mary seemed to blame George's wife for the trouble he found himself in. Mary asked the Lord to bless her firstborn and first lost son. When the time came for her to leave, Mary said to George, "Goodbye, Geordie, and a last kiss, for I'll never see you again on this earth." The two embraced, and as she left the cell, she stopped to turn round and have a final look at her doomed son. George also received a visit from his young brother Andrew. The young lad had been sent to the Mars training ship. This ship, permanently anchored in the Tay, housed poor, destitute boys, and taught them how to be sailors. The boy leapt on his brother and shared him with affection. Andrew had brought George a couple of gifts. One of them was a small box, and the other a little tobacco. When the prison governor reminded them that giving George tobacco would be against the rules, the young boy replied, "Man, you'll surely let him get a smoke." The authorities informed George that the Home Secretary had refused him a reprieve. The prisoner wept and sobbed for a while, but then seemed to come to terms with his fate. Spending time with the Reverend St. Clair, the prison chaplain, who read the scriptures aloud, they both sung hymns together. On the 8th of October, a letter arrived in Perth. It read, Whitehall, 6th of October 1874. To the Lord Provost of Perth, My Lord, I am to signify to you the Queen's commands, that the execution of the sentence of death passed on George McCallum, now in Perth County Prison, be respited until further signification on Her Majesty's pleasure. I am, my Lord, your obedient Richard Assheton Cross. The authorities decided to inform George of this news. As his cell in the jail was so small only 2 people could comfortably fit in at any time, it was decided to move George to a larger cell to hear the good news regarding his state of execution. The extra space was needed, for amongst the party giving the condemned men the news were Sheriff Barclay, Graham the Lord Provost, Mr. Maxton Graham of Cultiquai, who'd done everything possible to obtain mercy for McCallum, the Reverend Mr. St. Clair, the prison chaplain, the Reverend Mr. Mill of the West Church, and the prison governor, Mr. Wilson. When the guards escorted George to a larger cell, he became convinced that they were about to take him to his execution. His knees started knocking together, and his whole body started to shake uncontrollably. In the cell, Sheriff Barclay said to him, The Queen has been very good to you, George. You know, she's given you a week to prepare before you are hung. The confused McCallum replied, Yes, she has been very good. Barclay went on, What would you say if she were to give you another week? George answered, I would be very much obliged to her. The sheriff continued, And if she were to spare your life altogether? The provost then read out the letter to the prisoner. George could only stand and shake his head. Later, he would be heard weeping and thanking the Queen out loud. After the letter bringing a stay of execution, George received a visit from his father, who brought a cousin named Townsley. Townsley hugged and kissed George. George's father told him they had Mr. Maxton Graham of Cultiquai in the town of Perth to thank for being saved. Old McCallum told his son never to forget their kindness. George told his father to abstain from drink and to pass on this advice to the rest of the family. John McCallum stated he had not touched a drop of alcohol since his son's arrest, and that he would pass on the advice, but did not think it would have any effect on the rest. On the 15th of October, George McCallum received news from the Home Secretary that his life would be spared, and he received a sentence of penal servitude, imprisonment with hard labour, for life. The Dundee Courier of the 15th of October 1874 gives a brief description regarding the McCallum family and their origins and way of life, which you may find interesting. The paper states that George's father, John, came from the Argyllshire gypsies, and his mother from the Athol Tinkers. Born in Kintyre, George had no recollection of his early life, apart from hardship, constant wandering, and ever-attendant hunger. The family often worked the land, employed in farms to pick turnips and ties. In between agricultural work, the family peddled wicker baskets and horn spoons that they had made, travelling the countryside to attend fairs and markets. If you've enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe. You might like to take one of our dark history tours, ghost tours, or paranormal investigations that are held in Perthshire, Glasgow and Stirling. If so, please visit our website, which is www.historyandhorrortours.com. Thank you.